Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Women Across Cultures. Where are we going? Welcome to our friends from Miami-Dade, as well as what a turnout from all over the state of Florida, and to those across the United States and several foreign countries. I'm Kyle Siebrecht, Executive Director of Strength in Numbers, Power and Connection. This event is made possible by the City of Coral Gables, Miami-Dade County Cultural Affairs Department, and Florida Humanities with the National Endowment for the Humanities. The world has been turned upside down by the pandemic, political upheavals, racial unrest, climate change, gender inequality, and even threats to democracy. So where do we go from here? Today, we are honored to be joined by four renowned women authors across various cultures who share their unique visions for the future. Bandy Lee, the New York Times bestselling author and advocate for mental health assessments of elected leaders, President, World Mental Health Coalition. Andrea Pino-Silva, author, We Believe You, Survivors of Campus Sexual Assault Speak Out. Her work is featured in The Hunting Ground, an award-winning film about her campus assault activism. Lutze Segu, social justice doula and blogger, collaborates with organizations to improve their culture and policies regarding racism, gender, and LGBTQ biases. Jessica Valenti, the New York Times bestselling author of Sex Object, a Memoir, journalist, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the Guardian, and named one of the top 100 inspiring women in the world by the Guardian. So here's how today's program will go. First, each author will give a brief reading and discussion of her work. Then we'll have a 15-minute moderated discussion when our panelists will engage with each other on topics they have chosen to explore. Then we will take a brief break when you can grab a beverage from your fridge and rejoin the authors for a lively interactive Q&A session when you may address questions to any of the panelists. This program is being recorded. This presentation is intended for those 18 years of age or older, and speakers will give a trigger warning as appropriate. Now let's begin the program with Lutze Segu.
Thank you. I am coming to you all from the ancestral and traditional lands in Miami, of the Seminole, Miccosukee, and Takesa First Nations, and I'm going to be reading some things from my dissertation. So I am dropping right in the middle. Self-making is one of the most critical works that Black people participate in. How do Black people learn how to stand up straight in a crooked room, intent on misreading them? How do Black people cultivate their interiority and protect that interiority in a world that is intent on seeing the depth that is not, that in a world that is not intent on seeing the depth and the contours of Black people? This is where spirituality as a tool and intervention can become helpful to Black people who have a capacious understanding of spirituality. Defining spirituality. Jackie M. Alexander teaches us that the spiritual is political. Being that both the personal and spiritual are political, I am intrigued with wanting to capture how the spiritual animates Black survival. This question of how Black people survive and enact fugitivity has led me to make voodoo epistemology central in my research. Black people are master teachers in the art of survival and fugitivity, the act of stealing oneself back from the clutches of slavery and its afterlife. Voodoo emerges in the 18th century slave plantations in Haiti in the midst of chaos and suffering. Voodoo is a hybrid of African religions that is infused with colonial Catholicism. Voodoo is derived from voodoo, which is a word found in the Fon language, and it means sacred energy. Similar to Catholicism, voodoo has different figures that are used, but they are not saints. They are called lois. which means law. There are 5 fundamental tenets of voodoo epistemology I have constructed as an analytic. Number 1, land and water. The ancestors, plants, flora, and fauna have knowledge and medicine. Black people's bodies have been used to build up the wealth of Turtle Island, and wherever our ancestors are buried, so is our magic, liberation, and resistance present there, waiting to be conjured. Number 2, body. The body can be tamed and untamed, and can at any moment transgress gender and transcend sexual borders through possession during a voodoo ceremony. In voodoo, queerness is divine, sacred, holy, and above all, necessary to the ceremony. Number 3, ancestors. Practice ancestral veneration. Seek ancestral knowledge and help. The Loas are not saints. They are simply elevated ancestors waiting to be of service and to be recognized. Number 4, life. Life is made up of pain and suffering, and it is through rituals that we are able to make peace, fight back, or mitigate the pain and suffering of life. Life is also filled with joy and possibility, and we must be in ritual to fully access our Black joy. Number 5, fugitivity. Voodoo requires that you steal yourself back and practice refusal in order to set yourself free. Internal abolition is a practice that finds its animating force in the Haitian Revolution. These tenets serve as a roadmap that will help chart new territories and dimensions of understanding Black queer genders and sexuality. The analytical tool that is intersectionality, a framework that comes out of Black feminist thought, teaches that social categories and identities are not mutually exclusive. They work and build upon each other. By taking seriously all of the domination and oppression and the colonialism and chattel slavery used to create the Black category, it is only through engaging the spirituality in a political way can Black human beings truly understand themselves as themselves and their various intersections. Spiritual practice that demands its practitioners confront pain and suffering. Most beloved ancestors is Ezili Danto. In using voodoo epistemology, I recognize that voodoo has much to offer us in understanding Black, queer, and transgender subjects. The spiritual as epistemological pushes scholars to consider as fact the claim that Haiti's Masisi may be understood not only as Caribbean variations of transgender people, but also Ezili's children, and to seek out the social, economic, sexual, and kinship connections between Masisi and other voodoo practitioners that this understanding entails. Crucial spirits needed to know and commune with in order to understand queer and gender expansive Black people is the law and the ancestor called Ezili. The pantheon that is known as Ezili is described by Tinsley in the following way. Ezili is the name given to the pantheon of Loa who represent divine forces of love, sexuality, prosperity, pleasure, maternity, creativity, and fertility. She's also the force who protects Madivine and Masisi, that is transmasculine and transfeminine Haitians. And I was coming to see Ezili, not queer politics, not gender theory, was the prism through which so many contemporary Caribbean authors were projecting their vision of creative genders and sexuality.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to interject here that I attended your racial allyship workshop, and I wholeheartedly endorse anyone attending. Are you still giving those?
Yes, so yes, I haven't done that in a minute, but like yes, I am kind of known on this internet as a social justice doula, and I do a lot of work around anti-racism and stuff like that. So nothing public facing as of yet, but you know, follow your girl. I'll let you know when I'm doing all the things in the world to help us combat all of our things.
It was fantastic. I loved it, and I learned so much. It was wonderful. So thank you for making those available also to our community. Alrighty then, that was fascinating. That was just fascinating. Jessica, we're going to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. I am going to be reading from 2 columns that I've written recently that I think sort of speak to the idea of where we are and where we're going in 2022. And the first one is called The Cost of Managing Men's Anger: What Women Give Up to Keep Ourselves Safe. A viral TikTok taken this week by a 17-year-old girl confronting a man harassing her at the gym reminded me of how young we are when we start to manage men's anger. The teenager in the video yells at the 24-year-old man for bothering her, chastising him for not leaving her alone, even after she told him how young she was. His response: 17 is legal. It's legal. The man gets angrier and angrier, demanding that she leave the gym before I fucking lose my temper. Get the fuck out of here, he says. And she does, likely recognizing that his anger was quickly becoming dangerous. She took stock of the situation and made a decision, like so many of us have done before. Girls are barely out of childhood when they learn the ins and outs of men's moods, what sets them off, how much we can safely talk back to them, and how to calm them when it's necessary. It's a survival skill, one we have to master early. I often wonder if the stereotype that women have more emotional intelligence is true, or if we're just trying not to be killed. Of course, we're attuned to the world around us. We have to be. I also can't help but think about all the mental space taken up by that constant negotiation in our heads, gauging our safety while riding the train, instead of letting our minds wander back to that book that we read the previous week, worrying if the man behind us is following us home rather than finishing up a phone call to a relative, examining a Tinder match's red flags before a date when we could be thinking about or doing literally anything else. What ideas haven't we had? What realizations went unnoticed because our minds were so busy keeping us safe? To tell you the truth, it breaks my heart. But as my daughter gets older and starts to walk to her Brooklyn school with friends instead of parents, her first adult-free adventure into the world, I find myself desperately hoping that Layla has traded her daydreaming for vigilance. It's an awful thing, wishing for the end of your child's mental freedom, but I don't know a better way to protect her. I certainly can't depend on the world changing fast enough. If anything, men are becoming more entrenched in toxic ideology around gender roles. And while I'd love for my daughter, still only 11, to remain a child just a few years longer, I know how steep the consequences for naivety are. I'm glad the young woman in the video is safe. Many others haven't been. And I'm grateful that she had the wherewithal to film her encounter. Too many men don't understand how prevalent these kinds of interactions are and how profoundly they shape women's lives. I wish I could tell my daughter something different, reassure her that she can do whatever she wants, be whoever she wants, and think however she wants. But the truth is that her physical and mental freedom will only ever be as large as men's anger allows it to be. At least I suppose she'll never know the difference. The second piece I'm going to read from is a little bit different. It's called American Moms Are Being Gaslit. If staying home is so wonderful, why don't men do it? The latest discourse around motherhood sure sounds familiar. American women, we're told, are leaning out, not having enough children and not having them early enough in their lives. Oh, and childcare? It's not good for kids, so one parent should definitely stay at home. I'm sure you can guess which parent they mean. It's frustrating to be 42 years old, 43 now, and see the same conversations happening over and over again with few signs of progress. It's especially infuriating when it's clear why these issues are reemerging. Since the pandemic started, 2.5 million women have left the workforce. workforce and sexist culture is putting a rosy stay-at-home sheen on a shit show. This is a national emergency, one that will roll back women's gains in the public sphere by decades, and the response has somehow become about how moms want to be home with their kids anyway. A record number of women have been pushed out of their careers, perhaps forever, and we're meant to believe that women are fine, relieved even. It's obscene. There's been no comprehensive look at how fathers failed to step up, even when their wives' jobs were on the line, nor has the mainstream media really grappled with how much of a choice it is to stay at home when your partner won't do childcare or your kid's school is closed. Instead, we're stuck talking, again, about the supposed benefits of women leaving work. Now, not everyone loves their job, but why then isn't the conversation about making workplaces better rather than women just abandoning them? Also, if your job is underpaid and thankless, I have some news for you about motherhood. Most importantly, if staying at home with children is so important and so rewarding, why don't men do it? We all know the answer. The truth is that leaving the workforce hurts women. Stay-at-home moms are more likely to be depressed, isolated, and economically vulnerable. And instead of offering financial and systemic support to these mothers, mainstream culture tells them that they should feel fulfilled and fortunate to do the most important job in the world. This ensures that women who don't feel particularly lucky to be working 24/7, changing diapers and wiping noses, are often too ashamed to say anything about it. Pushing women to stay home doesn't just hurt those who leave work. Women who remain in their jobs are also harmed by attitudinal shifts that say families are better off with traditional structures. Men with stay-at-home wives are more likely to have negative views of women who work, for example, and we're already seeing that younger and supposedly more progressive men, have increasingly regressive beliefs about women's role at home. I'm also quite over the idea that it's just fine if women are erased from public life. I don't want to live in a country where women's voices aren't fully represented in every industry, whether it's government, media, banks, schools, or movie studios. When women aren't in the room, we end up with a world built for men. So let's be clear, women aren't leaving the workforce because they want to. They're leaving because America has put women, mothers especially, in an impossible situation. They're leaving because their male partners didn't do their fair share. And despite the culture's best effort to slickly reimagine this moment as one born of women's choices, the truth is far simpler. American women are being gaslit. Being pushed out of our careers is not a good thing, and it absolutely is possible to be a happy working parent, even now. How do I know that parents can have it all? That it's actually completely feasible to work and take care of children without giving up your career goals or life ambitions? Because men do it all the time.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And friends, if you are not subscribed to Jessica's newsletter, All in Her Head, do it right now.
Thank you.
You'll be waiting for it each week like I do. It's just, I don't know how you manage to top yourself week after week after week. That's all I'm going to say. Okay. Now I would like to, All in Her Head. That's the name. Is it allinherhead.com? Is that it? Could you repeat that, Jessica, please?
Sorry, I was muted. You could do All in Her Head or jessica.substack.com. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I would not be saying this for each of you if it weren't true. All righty. So now the next person that we're going to hear from is Andrea Pino-Silva. Andrea?
Hello. So this piece is from a chapter that I wrote for Colonize This that was edited by my friend Daisy Hernandez and her friend Bushra. And it's a piece I wrote around late 2019. So I think it's interesting because I think if I were to look at it differently, I would look at it a little different now. And when I wrote it, I was still very conflicted with my Latina identity, particularly as a queer woman. But I think that this particular part that I will read is still very much appropriate for how I feel about kind of reconciling my struggles with machismo, my queerness, and the love of my community. All right, so I will start now. Every morning before school, my abuelito and my hermanita waited for me in his 1989 Toyota Corolla, honking every few minutes to remind me that we would be late. I locked myself in our only bathroom, desperately trying to gel that untamable frizz around my face that prevented my hair from being properly contained. Complementing this mess was the ever persistent middle button of my white blouse that wouldn't close thanks to my growing chest. Nothing contained the marimacha in the mirror, and certainly not the constraints of a Catholic school uniform. There was never a time that I didn't struggle to balance my need for belonging and my insatiable need to question everything. I was never happy sitting in class and repeating oraciones. And when we had to go to confession, I would never feel the need to apologize for missing misa that Sunday when I had a very important episode of Sailor Moon to watch. I didn't really let myself process my queerness, but perhaps looking back, I knew that I didn't want to be Sailor Jupiter so much as date her. As a niña, I was starving for images of heroes, of mujeres who were free to ask questions without limitation. I had seen glimpses of these heroes in movies and books and in video games even, but they weren't Cuban and they weren't marimachas. And they weren't sitting alone in a bathroom dressed in a Catholic school uniform, questioning if they felt more trapped in a skirt or in their own community. I would spend years straightening my hair and my body, learning how to speak like the Americanas on TV, pretending to like that boy, the one that seemed least unbearable, and questioning if my ideas and accomplishments truly deserved merit. I wish I could say now that I found sense of belonging when I first sat down at the back of my Women's Studies 101 lecture in college. I hesitated then, just as I had when I had been a niña, to look around me and search for other mujeres like me who longed for the tenderness and nurture of comunidad. I approached my white women's studies professor about struggling to complete my assignments because I was overcome by my duty to combat sexual violence. In her office, when I was most starved for community and most alone in my pain and my rawness so soon after assault, my professor told me that I didn't understand feminism and that perhaps I should take time off. That was the last women's studies class I ever took. There were times when I believed that being a real feminist activist meant I had a duty to publicly relive my sexual assault in detail. At the same time, I could never make mistakes in my storytelling because life depended on me to be a perfect victim. I have had white women tell me I speak too fast and too passionately and too angrily. I have added an extra layer of foundation to my face and spoken extra slowly or sat in silence. I began to feel that to be a feminist, to be a hero, I had to pass as a white woman, as a straight woman, as an able-bodied woman. Sometimes I believe there isn't a place for my real voice in feminism. Sometimes I feel that the work I do isn't enough when there are dreamers, beautiful, questioning queer Latinas and survivors who won't ever pick up this book because they are trying to survive, luchando to pay their bills instead of taking that unpaid internship at an organization run by white feminists who memorize the word intersectionality for Women's Studies 101, but never thought it was important enough to write into their organizational bylaws. But now I am done letting them take my voice. White feminism, our stories and our bodies don't belong to you, but your spaces will one day belong to us. Okay, so that is just one part of the piece. The piece ends with me coming to terms with feminists in my own community and seeing my abuela and my mom as feminists and reconciling with the feminism that I learned in the classroom, not representing my community. So that's kind of what my journey was, which is still very representative, I think, of where I am right now. I just turned 30 this year, and for me, 30 was a groundbreaking moment as a woman, as a survivor, as a professional, because it's been over 10 years since I was sexually assaulted. The entirety of my adulthood has been activism, right? And for me, turning 30 meant reclaiming my womanhood and reclaiming what I wanted. And my desires, Dr. Eve Tuck talks about this a lot, what it means for us to center our desire. And for me, this year and this new decade of my life is centering my desire and what I actually want as a woman and not what I thought I wanted and the way that I was raised as a girl.
And that'll probably change again in another decade, and that's called growth. Thank you so much, Andrea. What I'm just going to say here after Andrea's wonderful reading is that if you have not seen The Hunting Ground, it features Andrea's work, and all I can say is I think I grabbed it off of Prime or something, and after I saw it, it's one of those films that for weeks afterwards, I was going around telling everybody I know, you got to see this. Have you seen it? You got to see it. You got to see it. It's so important. And I can't, thank you enough for your work and what has grown out of it. It's just, we've all experienced this. when we were in school, friends or ourselves. And it's just profound. Thank you so much. Okie dokie. Bandy, are you ready to share with us?
Yes.
All righty. Welcome to the podium.
Well, thank you. I will be reading from an article I'm working on. And essentially, I will be speaking about dominance hierarchies, gender inequality, and hypermasculinity today. Underlying all these is structural violence. As a violence expert, I often study the different forms of violence, and structural violence is an important one, a term that the great Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung coined. It's defined as the deliberate impairment of fundamental human needs by structures of power. While this is less visible than other forms of violence, structural violence is by far the most lethal form, causing more excess deaths, that is, deaths that would not occur in more equal societies, by the order of 10 times the deaths from all behavioral violence, that is, suicides, homicides, collective violence, massacres, wars, all those combined. Not only is it the deadliest form of violence, it grows exponentially as unequal power differentials are used to create more unequal structures. Structural violence is also the most potent stimulant of behavioral violence, such as homicides, suicides, mass murders, and war. So it's one of the most critical areas of violence to study in our day. Now, the rise in recent years of hypermasculine authoritarian leaders across the world demonstrates how sex and gender are a large part of contemporary international politics. Authoritarian leaders such as Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, Rodrigo Duterte, Mohammed bin Salman, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and others all portray themselves as hypermasculine. Authoritarianism means that authority and force will be concentrated in the hands of the few, away from the majority of the people, the rule of law, or the truth. Authoritarian power is often abused against their own people or other countries. There's obviously a link between the rise of authoritarian leaders, gender inequality, the decline of democracy, and the rise of war and violence. Dominance hierarchies arise from a minority of violent men ruling over other men, subordinating and controlling women and their bodies, and penalizing men or other genders who do not share their violent hegemonic masculinity. I would like to emphasize that it is not intrinsic differences between men and women that lead to greater levels of dominance, violence, and war, but rather the norms and values of dominance that diffuse throughout society. These norms may include the acceptance of hierarchy itself. In other words, society is divided into superior and inferior, and therefore there will be genders, skin tones, and within these groups, other characteristics that denote superiority. For example, there will be a dominant male gender, dominant skin tone, and dominant masculinity that are counted as superior to the subordinated female gender, subordinated skin tones, and subordinated masculinities. Evolutionary theorists posit that violent dominant males, under the consent of other male associates, are able to adopt a parasitic lifestyle based on force. With very little effort, but a willingness to harm, kill, and enslave others, they can be provided with every resource that natural selection predisposes them to desire, such as food, women, territory, resources, status, political power, and pride. In democratic societies with a strong rule of law, these men are typically found in jails and prisons. In weak authoritarian states, they rise to leadership. However, in the face of extreme economic inequalities that threaten human civilization, a climate crisis that imperils human habitability on Earth, and technology that can wipe out our species and many others in an instant from this Earth. Cooperativeness is strength for humankind, not dominance. And what is often overlooked is the need to have dominance in the first place, which arises from deep-seated sense of inadequacy and lack of self-worth. Destructive leaders generally display an overcompensating grandiosity, a predisposition to violence, the demand for complete subordination, paranoia, the vilification of opponents, narcissistic rage when challenged, and an inability to change course in the face of imminent disaster. In other words, so-called strongman leaders are in truth typically fragile men. In the context of contemporary crises, such as financial crises, destabilizing social and economic inequality, and mass immigration spurred by a climate devastation or war, provide the context in which destructive leaders can attract a critical mass of followers and rise to power. And this is a societal pathology, not a strength. So I will stop there. And
Thank you very much. That's a lot to think about. Just take a deep breath. Thank you, Bandy. I am just going to, of course, urge attendees to read your books. You present all sides. They're very readable, and they are essential to making sense out of our current world. So thank you so much for your work too. So now we're going to discuss some current issues among the panelists. First, as two fellow Floridians, I'd like to ask Lutze and Andrea to comment on the Don't Say Gay bill. Lutze and Andrea, what do you have to say?
Yes, so I have a master's in social work, and prior to going off and working on this PhD and doing this other stuff, I work primarily with LGBTQ youth experiencing houselessness. And so this Don't Say Gay bill, for me, from a social work standpoint, we're constantly reminded how in this society, we have to remind ourselves, outside of, we know that society hates women, hates femme, hates transgender and non-binary people. Second to that hatred is children. We act like we like children. We act like we love children. We act like we care about children, but we do not, because too many of us in our society are totally okay with the cannibalizing and the disappearing of children, especially if they're Black, especially if they are Indigenous. So when we're talking about this Don't Say Gay bill, we're talking about LGBTQ youth who intersect with all sorts of races, genders, ability status, you name it. And so for me, it's just, I don't know how we continue to arrive at these moments. We act like children are our futurity and then do everything in our power to ensure that kids don't even make it out of childhood and into adulthood because of the bullying of adults. And to me, this Don't Say Gay bill and trying to bind teachers in a very particular kind of way not to say this, and forcing, if a young person starts to experience themselves as queer or non-binary and they go to the school social worker, making it compulsory that the school social worker has to call the parent and kind of snitch on a child that might not be ready to tell their parent, who might be bullying them, who might be the hetero supremacist person that they need protection from, forcing all of these systems to collude with the abuse of children is just it's a lot to take in. So I just want us all to really remind ourselves, it's we have got to stop thinking about children as private property and start thinking about them as human beings who are sovereign and who are the most vulnerable in our society that need very vigilant, ethical adults to rally around them and for them and advocate on their behalf.
Thank you, Lutze. Andrea, is there something you would like to add?
There's a lot I can say about this, but I think for the purposes of adding on to what Lutze said, there is a criminalization of queerness in the world, but in our country, and this white supremacist country that has used education as its lackey is threatened by a generation of people who feel liberated to talk about queerness, to talk about Blackness, to talk about chattel slavery, to talk about the stains of this country's legacy that are a threat to those in power. And it doesn't matter really what the topic is at this point. It's anything that really threatens those in power and threatens their legitimacy to continue to recruit people that will continue to sustain that power. And that has always been this country's legacy, and I think about, for example, the lack of education that we had about the Japanese concentration camps in this country that generations of students have just simply not known about. This country does this. But I think when it comes to what Lutze was saying, is that this bill is a death sentence for queer youth. It just is, point blank. I went to a Catholic school up until high school, and we were shamed for talking about queerness. I mean, for me, queerness was not even a possibility because it was criminalized in the classroom. So what that does is that it keeps us in the closet. And I'm thankful enough to have a family that has supported me. That is not the standard for many people. And for me, coming from an immigrant family, we didn't have the tools to know how to talk about queerness. We simply just didn't. Even when I'm here in Miami, many of the spaces that I had been to that were queer spaces were white spaces. We didn't have a lot of access to queer spaces in my community. A lot of them were not accessible to Spanish-speaking people. So for some people, for some students, their queer communities oftentimes in the classroom. And to say that queerness is now criminalized, it's a death sentence. And I say this as a person whose life has been marked by very key moments around the criminalization of queerness. Lawrence v. Texas, I was a child when that happened. The fall of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The first election that I voted in was against a marriage amendment in North Carolina, which passed. And this criminalization of queerness is not new, right? And I think that one thing I want folks to really know is that just because we have the placebo of Obergefell v. Hodges does not mean that queerness will no longer be criminalized in this country. And if it's not queerness, it's transness, and that's just how it is. So I think that for parents particularly, it's important to speak up. Because the truth is that a queer person, whether that queer child is yours or someone in your community, and we know that we have an existing mental health crisis, and we know that queer people are more likely to struggle with mental health. We need to treat this as a threat to our children's lives.
Thank you. And now this is reminding me about what you had to say in Ahead of the Curve about there being a safe place for youth to come out and know that they can be safe. So thank you so much, for your work, and thank you for talking with us about it. The next question that I would like to ask is, let's see. Yeah, Bandy, you have famously assessed the mental health of world leaders for the public good, and stated that psychological vetting of leaders in general has become a public health emergency. Since it seems governments are unlikely to cooperate in this regard, where can citizens get this information? How do citizens know whether this or a candidate for president is has a psychological condition that means that really they should not be that it's not safe to vote for them? What do you say, Bandy? How can we know? Where can we get the information?
Yes, I started my public career, if you will, or overtly public career, with speaking up about the president-elect Donald Trump. And I sensed a danger to public health at the time, not so much a political issue. And I wasn't political before then. So I assembled my colleagues and published the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. It became an unprecedented New York Times bestseller of its kind. And we rose in the media to the #1 topic of national conversation. But because a bunch of mental health professionals speaking up was so unexpected and so explosive, the American Psychiatric Association stepped in ways that did not have anything to do based on scholarship or precedent, and basically gaslit the nation into thinking that any mental health professional who speaks up about a political figure is being unethical. But in fact, I believe that education of the public is critical, especially at a time when mental impairment is increasingly found in world leaders, especially in weakened states. And most recently, people were surprised about the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian leader, because many assumed that he was a rational, cold, calculating person who would not engage in self-destructive and such meaninglessly violent acts. And I believe those are the kinds of traits and personality structures that mental health professionals study all the time, and we encounter them all the time, especially someone like myself as a forensic psychiatrist. I work with prisoners, I evaluate violent offenders, and so I've seen about 1,000 or so individuals with the same characteristics. So to see the public so misled and deceived for so long by these leaders, and they often are charismatic, they often put on a very effective, masterful mask of sanity, when in fact they're quite impaired, and the impairment comes out in the self-destructiveness. They may destroy the world before they destroy themselves, but they always do destroy themselves. And so I believe that we need to start with education. We need to start with mental health professionals speaking with the public, engaging the public, educating the public about this phenomenon, just as we need infectious disease specialists speaking to the public about a pandemic and educating the public to protect themselves. We need to speak about these psychological matters. It's not to excuse the individual. In fact, few of these individuals are exonerated in the criminal setting because they know the difference between right and wrong, but they are psychologically destructively impaired. And especially now that they are increasingly highly attracted to power positions and able to get there, we need to educate ourselves as a part of our democracy, as a part of informed citizenry, and to be able to make an informed choice in our elections.
Well, who's going to educate us if the American Psychological Association will not allow professionals to educate us?
Well, the thing is, it's not based on it's certainly not law, and it's certainly not even ethics. The latest scholarly work will show that we have a duty to the public far before we have a duty to public figures. And we have a professional responsibility to society as well as to patients. I mean, we practice public health all the time, and education is pretty much the premier mode of intervention in the public health sense. And now someone has mentioned the public mental health crisis that we're facing. We do need mental health professionals to speak up in public. And when public figures pose a threat to public health, then we need not step back, because political figures, powerful political figures, should not be in a privileged position where they are protected no matter what they do and no matter what condition they display.
So are healthcare professionals not in danger now of having their licenses pulled?
We were never in danger. As I said, it was
Okay.
a public relations campaign that had nothing to do with actual ethics. It was based on, I would say, an authoritarian impulse of wishing to please the powerful political figure in power, and a distortion of ethics, a pretty perverse twisting of what was originally meant to be a reasonable ethical guideline, but it was turned into something it was never intended to be. It was never intended to be a silencing mechanism. It was a guideline for speaking in public and for fulfilling our societal responsibility, not to silence us.
Okay, great. Thank you. Andrea, you have spoken out in Believe Me about como eres, young women being respected as you are. And Jessica has written about the sexualized teenagers in the popular new series Euphoria. Hollywood claims it's just being authentic. Would you each like to comment on what the media is saying about and to young women in this popular show? And Jessica, how would you feel about your daughter watching the show in a few years?
Sure. I wrote a piece about this, and I think it's not just Euphoria, obviously, that sort of peddles in the objectification of young people. But the reason I sort of set my sights on Euphoria was because of its popularity. And because, as you said, we do sort of hear over and over again, like we want to be authentic. We're trying to show, real teenage life. And I think that is great. I do think that we need to have conversations about teenage sexuality. I think that there needs to be sort of transparent representation around what teenagers' lives really look like. But I think that there's a big difference between that and titillation and objectification. And I think that we cannot call ourselves a society that doesn't believe in the sexualization of children and at the same time sort of have these like really graphic scenes where you're literally showing naked actors who are adults who are meant to be playing 15, 16, sometimes younger year-olds. And so, yeah, I have a real concern about the message we're sending about it being okay to sexualize young people. And by having these older actors play teenagers, we're sort of giving a false impression of how mature young people actually are, right? Like if you have a teenager, if you have a young child, you know that someone who is 15 and 16 does not look like a 26-year-old actor or actress. They look young. And so I do have a lot of concerns about it.
Andrea, do you want to comment? Does this cross over into your area about concerns for assaults on campus?
I wouldn't say that it like directly translates to assault, but I will say like my partner and I like live for teenage drama shows. Like some we like, some we don't. I will say that I got through one episode of Euphoria and said no thanks. And the reason is because I think because of the work that I do, I am just really tired of shows that center narratives of damage, that talk about just these terrible things that happen to girls. I think particularly girls of color, like honestly, I oftentimes ask my friend, have you seen this yet? Is there a terrible rape? Does someone die? Does someone attempt suicide? What happens? I don't want to watch it. And that's just because these narratives are just our industry is just saturated with it. And I'm just kind of tired of them. I think it's really interesting what Jessica was saying about, and I read her piece about adults playing kids in sexual scenes, because, I don't feel as bad about sex education and I don't know why. And maybe it's because the show centers joy, and that's why I don't think so much about it. And as the seasons go on, they stopped having a lot of graphic sex, and it was more about the kids. But then I think of the show Everything Sucks that was canceled by Netflix, that was mainly children that were being played. One of the love interests was an adult, and then there were a lot of complaints about that because, like, what are you doing having a 14-year-old in a romantic relationship with an adult? But I think besides that, which I think is definitely troubling, I think the show was very much catered to children's stories. It wasn't hypersexualized. It was very much just their angst, and it was children playing it. And I do think that those stories are much more authentic. And as it is, there's just so much pressure to sexualize children. I mean, I think a lot of growing up in Miami, and I mean, we were talking about makeup and eyebrows and getting your legs waxed before we turned 15. I mean, the quinceañeras were like that moment where, like, if your parents didn't let you by then, like, good luck going to high school. But that was very much growing up here, right? So this hypersexualization is something that I'm very intimately familiar with. And I do think that if I were to make a choice as a parent, like I would tell my child that they don't have to grow up so quickly, and that girlhood, niñez, is really important. So I'm really worried about how these narratives push young girls to grow up really quickly. And I think particularly with sexual assault, it's important for us to remember that these are children, not adults.
Thank you. That's very helpful, very interesting. So we're going to have a quick 5-minute break, and everybody can grab their tea, their juice, their wine, and come back for a lively interactive Q&A after party, which is when you may address any of the speakers. Please submit your questions for the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for one of the panelists, please make sure to type out the speaker's name at the beginning of your question. Okay, we'll see you in 5 minutes at the after party.